Hi American history students. In this video I'm just going to introduce you to what it is that historians do and why we make you study history, 2 classes at GHC, when you can basically look up all of the facts that you need to know. So first of all, welcome to History 2111, that's American history up through 1877. The bulk of our story will begin after 1492. In fact, the bulk of our story will really kind of begin after the founding of Jamestown in 1607. But we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the indigenous tribes and indigenous civilizations that existed prior to the arrival of the Europeans, just to give us a little bit of background context and to explore, change and continuity on the American continent. So we'll go from the arrival of the Europeans up through the end of Reconstruction, talking about a number of changes that sweep through the United States, the British colonies, and then what would become the United States as we go. You can find my contact information in the purple at the bottom. My name is Dr. Fagan. My email address is jfagan, so just my first initial and my last name, at highlands.edu. I do try to check that email regularly, so feel free to send me an email. If you haven't heard back from me within 24 hours, 48 on the weekend, but within 24 hours, please follow up. I will never ignore you on purpose, but I get a lot of emails over the course of a day or a week, and sometimes things slip through the cracks. So give me 24 hours to get back to you. If you haven't heard from me before then, or by then, shoot me another email, or you can call or text me to see what's going on. I do provide you with my cell number, so you're welcome to call me or to text if you have any questions. The only thing I ask is that you consider the best route for whatever question you're going to ask. In other words, if it's a question that can be answered in a couple of sentences, that's a great question for text. If it's a question that needs, a paragraph or two, maybe shoot that one to me by email. And it's going to take more explanation than that, like if you need to review, the long-term causes of the Civil War, the long-term causes of the American Revolution. Let's just arrange a time to talk by phone or in my office hours by Zoom so that we could really dig into the material. I would also ask that you consider the time when you call or text. I usually turn my ringer off when I go to bed, but if I don't want to be awakened at like 2 a.m. with a text message about history class. So just think about those things. What's the best medium for asking your question, and what's the best timing for asking your question? Otherwise, you're free to use call, text, or email to get in touch with me over the course of the class. So I like to start my classes with a discussion of what is history. And if we were in class, I would ask you to brainstorm. What do you think history is? And typically the answer that I get is, well, history is what's happened in the past. And that's true. History is what's happened in the past. It's all of the things that have happened in many different realms that have brought us to where we are today. But, that definition of history isn't complete. It doesn't take us all the way. It doesn't explain really what history is, how people become professional historians, and why the University System of Georgia makes you take history classes in order to be a well-rounded student. So history is more than just the sum of events that happened in the past. History as a discipline, history as a profession, history as a way of knowing about the world, is really at its core about making sense of incomplete evidence. So professional history, or what could be identified as professional history, emerged in the 19th century in Germany. And it was associated with a man named Leopold von Ranke. And what happened was that von Ranke would basically come in and say, all right, if we want to study the past, we need to study the past critically. We can't have this patriotic view of the past. We can't have this religious view of that past. We can't have this, kind of optimistic, best of all possible worlds view of the past. If we want to study the past, we have to study it for what it was, good and bad. And so Ranke would come up with this principle of studying the past from a secular and unbiased, or as unbiased as possible, perspective. And he said, so you have to approach it professionally, and you have to approach it not based on what you wish happened, not based on what you want to have happened, but based on what actually did happen. And the best way to get at that, according to early professional history, was through the use of what are called primary sources. Historians use three types of sources. There are primary sources, there are secondary sources, and then there are what are called tertiary sources. Primary sources are sources that were created during the period being studied by someone with knowledge of the topic that they're writing about. So, a journal entry, a newspaper article from the Civil War, letters, wills, tax records. All of those are examples of primary sources. Secondary sources are written by generally historians, but they're written by professionals, by academics, who use the primary sources and what they know about the past to make an argument about the past. They try to explain how and why things happen, identifying points of continuity, points of change, trying to get at causation. A way of thinking about it is to say, for historians, X factors, whatever those factors might be, lead to Y outcomes. So historians want to understand why things unfolded the way they did. And as historians make those arguments, they produce them in books and articles that are called secondary sources. Secondary sources are largely based on the analysis of primary sources. Then you have tertiary sources, and these are things like textbooks, encyclopedias, online articles from history.com, anything like that just basically gives you the narrative. They don't really make an argument, so they're not secondary sources. They weren't produced in the period being studied, so they're not primary sources. They give you an overview of what was happening in the past. So we call those tertiary sources. Being able to use all three of those sources allows historians to better understand the past. And in so doing, they are evaluating an incomplete record. The historical record is incomplete, and it's incomplete for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that not all sources, not all documents stand the test of time. The further back in time you go, the more likely that you'll have, or I guess the less likely you'll have a lot of sources to choose from. More sources disappear or are destroyed or are lost as time kind of passes. So in other words, if you're trying to study classical Rome, you'll have far fewer sources to look at and to examine than if you're trying to study, say, the 1950s in the United States. So part of it is that the record doesn't always stand the test of time. But another reason that the record is incomplete is that not all voices and not all experiences are recorded in our historical record. They aren't recorded in the sources that we have. There is a power dynamic at play in the historical record, which is to say that the wealthier and more powerful a person was, the more likely they were to record their voices, to have their voices in the narrative. This was for a couple of reasons. Number one, the elite were more likely to be educated, which meant that they were more likely to be literate. And literacy is important in keeping the written records that are the basis of the study of history. Number two, the elite tended to make up the newspaper reporters, the property owners, the courts, the public office holders who left their voices behind, who left records behind. So, for example, one of the things that historians will study is tax records. Well, in order to leave a record, you had to pay taxes, and generally in order to pay taxes, you had to own property. So those records are skewed towards property owners. Another thing that historians will study are merchant records. And merchants tended to keep records, but merchants also had a degree of wealth. They might not own landed property, but they owned their businesses, they kept records of transactions that they made, and so we have the records from their perspective. We don't, on the other hand, tend to have a tremendous number of records from working class people, for example. So, in studying industrialization, we are able to find fairly easily records from the property owners or from the factory owners. We have far fewer records from the factory workers. Similarly, we have a number of records from slave owners, but far fewer records from enslaved people themselves. We tend to have more records from men than women, more lasting records from men than women. And so our record, there are some voices missing from our record. There are some experiences missing from our record. Historians have tried to get around that, and we will look at some of the sources that historians have used to incorporate minority voices into American history. We'll look at a variety of different perspectives on what happened in the past as we move through this course. But I do want you to understand that what historians do is they make arguments based on incomplete evidence. And as a result, history isn't about truth with a capital T. Contrary to what you might hear in the media or from politicians, history isn't unchanging. Now, what happened in the past isn't changing, but our understanding of why it happened and why it's important and what lessons it has for us is changing all the time. As we discover new evidence and new ways of exploring or understanding that evidence, our understanding of the past changes. So the reason that you take a history class like this one at Highlands or elsewhere in your college career is not that you need to memorize, the dates of the Civil War. You can look that up. You don't need to memorize who the 3rd, 4th, or 5th president of the United States was. You can look that up. Instead, what we'll be doing is trying to get at the thinking skills, the way that the historian understands the world around him or her. So the way that historians look at the past is different, the way that historians look at the world is different than the way that, say, scientists do, or philosophers, or mathematicians. Historians look at the world to understand causation through 6 basic thinking skills, or through 6 basic processes. One is chronological thinking. Historians always approach the world by understanding change over time. If we look at the transition from the past to the present, there have been things that have changed and things that have stayed the same. So identifying points of change, but also identifying points of commonality, or points of continuity, as historians call it, is key to the historical profession. We need to identify moments of change so that we can understand and identify causes. Why did they change? The second is context and corroboration. Historians put sources in context. We can't ever let sources just speak for themselves because all sources were created within a specific context. Something was going on in the world around them. They were created by authors who had their own perspective, their own biases, their own purpose. And in order to understand that, we have to understand the context in which they were produced. So we will repeatedly look at primary sources and understand what was going on in the world, who made it, why they made it, who they intended it for, so that we can understand what it means and what its value is. Further, historians look for corroboration. If you find one source suggesting something, can you find other sources that corroborate that? Or is your first source an outlier? Never allow one source to speak for the past in its entirety. So historians always contextualize and corroborate. The third key historical thinking skill is historical empathy, and this is the ability to look at the past from the past's perspective, not ours. So it's putting aside judgment, particularly moral judgment about the past, in order to consider and understand why people did the things they did, given the world in which they lived. This does not mean that you have to approve of it. It does not mean that it is a good thing. It just means that historians are not interested in judgment. Historians are interested in understanding. and analyzing. So to that end, we have to analyze the world. We have to analyze our documents from the perspective of the world in which they lived and not ours. Fourth, historians engage in inquiry-based learning. History is a very structured process in which historians start with questions that they want answered. They develop strategies to answer those questions using primary sources, and then they use those primary sources to answer the questions. So historians don't write about what they know, or they don't start with what they know. They start with what they don't know, and then they develop ways of figuring out what they don't know. How can I answer that question? And it's oftentimes a bit like putting a puzzle together or acting like a detective. You answer one question and that sparks new questions. And as you accumulate this information, as you accumulate the data, you start to make sense of that data. Your fifth historical thinking skill is source analysis. This is using primary sources to answer those questions, but using those primary sources critically, not accepting them as truth with a capital T, but rather thinking about the context, the audience, the purpose, the significance, and how all of those things shape the credibility and usefulness of the document itself. We'll get lots of practice with that, and it will be one of your testing questions. One of the testing sections is the ability to analyze a primary source for audience, context, purpose, significance, and credibility. And finally, all of the other five kind of fit into number 6. Historians make evidence-based arguments. If history is about more than memorizing names and dates and facts, if history is about making sense of incomplete evidence and making arguments based on that evidence, then history is at its core about interpretation and argumentation. Historians put together arguments. And when I say argument, I don't mean yelling and screaming and calling people names. I mean establishing a thesis and proving that thesis with historically specific evidence. Everyone who talks about history, everyone who uses history, everyone who mentions history, interprets history because they're making an argument. And what I want you to develop in this course is the ability to evaluate those arguments. Are they convincing or not? And when I say are they convincing, I don't mean do you like them? Do you agree with them? Do they speak to your soul? No, I mean, does the evidence back up the argument that they make? So we'll be working on that over the course of the class. We'll do some work in class, you'll do some practice work outside of class, and then you'll have an out-of-class project that will tie all of these things together as you evaluate historical fiction. But we'll talk more about that in class on Thursday, so I'm going to end this video here as you think about the historical thinking process.